This show is brought to you by Podetize, podcast hosting and done-for-you production services that get you heard by more of your ideal listeners. Visit podetize.com to book a free strategy call. That's PODETIZE.com.
Edible it's a very fuzzy boundary. And the yew is a great example. It's mostly very poison except for this one little thing where if you eat the little sort of jelly around the seed, which is also extremely poisonous. So, it's this tiny little piece that's edible. And then there's lots of other things that might be edible if they're processed correctly. And that usually means maybe, unearthing some old knowledge about how to do that, or whether that means making it at least palatable and edible.
Welcome to Care More, Be Better, a podcast for people like you who care about the social impact of conscious companies and everyday heroes. Hear inspiring stories from those who put people and planet before profit and personal gain. You'll learn how you can make a difference, vote with your dollars, and get involved today. Here's your host, Corinna Bellizzi.
Hello, fellow do-gooders and friends. I'm your host, Corinna Bellizzi, an activist and cause marketer who's passionate about social impact, sustainability, and regeneration. As many of you know, I have worked to create a 5-step activist guide to help you unleash your inner activist. All you have to do is visit my website, caremorebebetter.com, and join the email list. As soon as you do so, you'll get a welcome email, including a link to download the guide. Today, I'm finally going to get to dig a little bit deeper into 2 things we covered in our regeneration series as we meet Ethan Welty. Ethan is a postdoctoral researcher at the World Glacier Monitoring Service and University of Zurich. He's a photographer and also the co-founder of Falling Fruit, a technology-focused 501c3 nonprofit organization that's mapping the world's edible plants. They have developed an online platform to promote urban foraging and local food. This is so awesome. I'm honestly a little thrilled I get to talk about this today. Ethan, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, Corinna.
Well, I'm thrilled you're here. And as we get to jump into this discussion on urban foraging, guerrilla gardening, and local food, I'd love to learn more about what you're presently doing in your postdoctoral research.
Something rather very different, actually. So my life had been kind of following parallel paths, and I have this background in math and physics, and then I got involved in environmental science more generally and did my PhD on glaciers using time-lapse photography to look at rapid glacier retreat and, the rapid changes to landscapes with climate change. And so now I just recently landed in Switzerland to continue that work. I'm basically a programmer for the World Glacier Monitoring Service. So I'm helping them to better manage submissions of glacier observations around the world. So there's scientists in every country that has glaciers and has people studying glaciers. They're reporting back their observations. And then the World Glacier Monitoring Service compiles them for use for analysis, for reporting to governments, to the UN and other sort of larger international bodies.
So it sounds like you got to combine a couple of things here, your love of photography and also of research as you did your undergrad work and now in your postdoctorate fellowship, correct?
Yeah, and some other themes too. There's definitely the more sort of technical, sort of computer science side. For whatever reason, I've been drawn to projects I can build with those skills, and also geography. Mm-hmm. I think that was also a passion that's played out in different ways, whether that's mapping glaciers or that's mapping edible plants.
Well, using technology to better our lives, so to speak. I spent a bit of time poking around the website and it's quite simple, but also I was surprised to see how many fruit trees in my neighborhood aren't logged, for example. So I plan to go in there and actually add the lemon trees. There's a couple of what look like volunteer plum trees in my neighborhood as well. And I will say that the fruit they produce is kind of more pit than fruit, but
maybe they need a little help.
They can make a great jam. If somebody wanted to volunteer water them, I'm sure they would do much better. And so I've been looking at all of those things too in my own community. There are a couple plots of land that I think might even be really suitable for a guerrilla gardening project. But, there's of course some legalities, or if you can actually get permission from the city to do things like that, that can actually be another way to turn unused land into a food source for your community. So I was hoping you could just talk about how you founded Falling Fruit with your co-founders, like what led to it, how'd you get here, and where do you see it going from here?
Sure. I think myself and my co-founders all have slightly different stories of our origin, but they all shared this theme that in different ways we came to the realization that there was a lot of food growing in our neighborhoods. For me, I had this mental switch when I was making beer. I moved to Boulder, Colorado for graduate school. I was brewing beer. I then also started to make apple cider. And that meant finding apples for my apple press. And so that led me to wanting larger volumes of apples than I could provide for myself from the trees in the yard of the house I was living in. And some friends introduced me to some apple trees they had spotted from the bike trail. And I think just this switch in my mind that when I went from the city is someplace that's separate from where the food comes from to this realization that, oh no, the city is an environment where there could be food if only I look. I just saw much more that I had missed over the years. So I started to see the city very differently and notice details that I had missed. And as I got really into it, I was also realizing that it's quite a bit of work to keep track because unlike, commercial orchard, say, every tree is on its own schedule. There might be many different varieties. So I had these this is before I was very organized with, modern technology. So I had like everything separate, like the notepad and the handheld GPS and a camera and trying to keep track of all of these different places. And I got quite good at it. So I was so this would have been in 2012 sometime. And by that fall, I was getting all the fruit I needed from the streets of Boulder. But I also was noticing that I was the only person doing this. And so I thought, well, that's a missed opportunity because there's actually quite a lot here. It's quite a lot of fun. And people seem very surprised. Like I would easily blow people's minds by just picking a chair, an apple off a tree. Like that was, that's all it took. And so people were not noticing. They hadn't had that switch. In their mind, I thought, oh, maybe I could find a way to share this project with others. And actually, it was through another program in Boulder called Boulder Food Rescue, which is a retail level food rescue organization. I was wanting to volunteer with them. And at that meeting, I met a co-founder of Boulder Food Rescue who also was very into foraging and had the same experiences and thought, hey, we should build a platform. And so we partnered together. That was Caleb Phillips. And he's a computer scientist through and through and had all the skills that I, certainly at the time, did not have. And together we got to work, and many sleepless nights later, I think it was about 3 months, we launched Falling Fruit in March 2013, more or less how you see it now. So yeah, that was kind of my journey. And I want to add one element that really shaped the project was I had gotten my hands on the City of Boulder's tree inventory, actually from a different project. And I thought, hey, this is, the city arborists, they've already gone through the trouble of mapping all these trees on, city streets, in the parks, their precise location and the species, or maybe even the cultivars. I can use this as a tech forager. Mm-hmm. So I was using that at least as an initial guess for where I could find some interesting things. And that really shaped the focus of Falling Fruit, any existing knowledge that could help the forager. And so I brought in the Boulder tree inventory, but also the inventory for a lot of other cities. And since then, I've tried to be very rigorous, I guess, in our management of the information that we're hosting on the platform.
Well, one of the things that I do every day, I take a long walk with my dog around my neighborhood, right?
Okay.
If you want to kind of get location, I'm in Scotts Valley, California, and we're abutting a chaparral oak forest, but then right next to a bunch of redwoods, right?
Oh, wow.
So it's kind of like a rolling hill. On one side is more exposed and the other side is more deep creviced, like mountainous range, right? So you have two very different climates that kind of come together here. And as you walk around the neighborhood, I have neighbors who have planted grapes that they're really purely ornamental, like they don't do anything with it, but it climbs up a trellis and they let the fruit just fall. And a good part of that vine is actually over the fence. And so when it's ripe, I pick them and take them home to my family. It's the same thing with plum trees, pomegranate, apple, and pear in my neighborhood. A lot of people just don't care about the stuff that's on the side of the fence and it falls. And I imagine it's the same story on the inside of their yards. So I've been kind of debating on at what point I kind of just go door knock and say, are you open to like letting me come in and harvest your tree? Because I've also done similar things in the past where I had a friend who had an apple tree in their yard. It was like a very old apple, very tall. We lost it in a storm and ended up splitting. It had to be cut down, but we would get incredible yields from that fruit tree. I would literally be climbing the branches and shaking it so the apples would fall, and then we'd press everything right then. So it wouldn't matter if it got like minutely bruised because you're running the press literally right in the yard and making cider with your friends, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I've just been involved in some of this stuff over the years and always felt like it didn't make a lot of sense that we spend all this money as different municipalities planting trees and shrubs and other sorts of plants that don't produce a yield, that are in public spaces, and that could be put you could put something else, like instead of a poisonous shrub like the oleander, which is everywhere, you could plant a strawberry tree, which is kind of a bush that has a fruit that you can eat, that's edible, that the birds eat, that people eat. I mean, I've shown my kids that these are delicious fruits. And so I've picked them with them and they're like, oh, it tastes great. And it's a great source of vitamin C. And it's something that you can't just go and buy at a typical grocery store. It's a way to kind of teach people to be more engaged with the nutrition that they're bringing into their bodies, to get kids involved and thinking about where food comes from. And to me, it just makes so much more sense to consider even working with our local cities to plant edible plants as opposed to just ornamentals in different areas.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've touched on the main long-term mission here of the Falling Fruit Project. Yeah, of course, it's, first and foremost, it's a tool for individual foragers, but I really think of it as a way to reimagine what cities can provide us. I'm not claiming that, we can grow all the food that we need inside the city. I don't think that would actually necessarily be a very efficient way to approach the problem. But as you pointed out, like there's all these benefits, right, to sharing our city with food-bearing plants that are both for nutrition, but also for community, for education, for just understanding where food comes from, and like greater botanical knowledge and the cycles of nature, and like there's all these things. And so, I see our role a little bit just here's what's already in most of the time accidentally already available in your city, right? Maybe because in some landscaping, some food-bearing species snuck through and made the cut, and go and harvest them. But imagine, of course, okay, well, as you pointed out, all the other plants, that's not the case. Imagine if all of the trees in the city were, food-bearing in some way. Why not? There's a lot of reasons for the why not. There's a lot of squeamishness, I think, around the commons. Like, oh, well, then if we have this abundance, maybe someone will get more than their fair share. These ideas about there's sort of fear that someone might get more than they deserve. There's definitely classism around foraging, and it's how it's seen as kind of lower class, or admitting to being hungry or something, and also sort of bringing in, kind of mixing the urban with the rural in a way that some people who are in the cities are less so, but, sort of wanting those worlds to be kept separate. And then there's also just the really practical concerns, mostly from the cities, about, is it going to make a mess if people don't harvest? There's a gap, or there could be a gap between the supply and the demand. Right now, there's a big supply and no demand. We're working on there to be a big, let's say a moderate supply and no demand. We're trying to get the demand up to meet the supply, so that then hopefully we can really start conversation with cities and say, the residents of your city have met the supply. Let's now talk about growing the supply as the demand grows. These are the really big picture ideas. And that's something I would love to have more time for, honestly, is really starting to work with city governments, because that's going to be the way to really change the landscape of our urban environments. They're the ones making those decisions, with guidance from all of us, but we have to make our desires known. And that means also getting more people on board with this vision of the city.
Well, I have some thoughts around all of these things, both from my personal life and also just from, so my father's a landscape architect, right? And so he has mostly worked in the business and very high-end residential world, right? And what he has commonly seen is that people have a reticence to place or to plant fruiting trees and fruiting plants because they tend to attract more birds and squirrels and things like that they may just consider pests.
Oh, that sounds lovely to me.
Yeah. Or they're worried about the tree fall or just, having all the fruit fall to the ground and make a mess. Now, the one case in which I completely agree with that is probably the olive tree, because every time you see an olive tree planted, they bear a ton of fruit. And if they are not actually harvested, it ends up on the sidewalk. It stains the sidewalk. It's hard to clean up. So there are certain instances where I think, okay, that makes sense from a city perspective. Why would you want to plant a bunch of olive trees that most people aren't going to go and just forage? Right? They, first of all, don't necessarily identify.
Depends where you are.
They don't know it's an olive. They don't know how to process it, or they think that you have to do all this work to marinate it or get the oil out or whatever. So they just let it kind of drop to the ground. Whereas if that was an apple tree or a pomegranate or something else, they'd be more likely to grab it and say, oh, look at this delicious snack here.
I recognize this from the store. It's like you don't need more education. Yeah.
That's exactly right.
You just need to notice it.
Yeah. Or something like the strawberry tree, which a lot of people don't know is food. They just think it's some fruiting bush that, hey, commonly if you see a fruiting bush and it's got red berries on it of any sort, you think it's poisonous, so you don't touch it. Now, having a dad who was a landscape architect, he taught me about plants. He's like, oh, this is a fruit. And I like to use these in different projects that I work on in Silicon Valley because they do well in the environment. They don't take much maintenance. You don't have to water them much, and they produce fruit. So you get birds that will eat them. And if you want to pick it, you can pick it yourself too. So I'm like, great. That sounds like a really good solution. Why don't we have more of that? Why do we continue to place oleander everywhere you could possibly think of, when oleander is actually poisonous? And my own husband once actually consumed some and ended up in the hospital as a 3-year-old, It's a reality. When it's used so much as an ornamental bush, kids put things in their mouth and can end up, in serious trouble.
I'm amazed. There's a lot of yew planted landscaping, at least in Switzerland, which there is 0.01% of the tree is edible and the rest is extremely poisonous. So it's it's a strange choice.
What is a yew?
A yew, Taxus genus, right? They're these very deep green evergreen. They look like almost Christmassy evergreens, extremely waxy, deep green. And they have these arils. So not technically a fruit. It's pink colored that wraps a seed. And so that's this pink, these little pink dots on a very, very dark green background. They're very common ornamental here. They're one of the most poisonous plants in the world. I mean, there's all these crazy stories of archers that, they made bows out of the wood and they would die from poisoning over time from just holding the wood, livestock dying, when the trimmings are thrown over into a field and they ate it and collapsed. I mean, yeah.
Wow.
I'm trying to think of another aspect of you touch on is, of course, that there's edible it's a very fuzzy boundary. And the yew is a great example. It's mostly very poison except for this one little thing where if you eat the little sort of jelly around the seed, which is also extremely poisonous. So, it's this tiny little piece that's edible. And then there's lots of other things that might be edible if they're processed correctly. And that usually means maybe, unearthing some old knowledge about how to do that. Mm-hmm. Or whether that means making it at least palatable and edible. The two things often are necessary ultimately. And we see that a little bit on the platform. There's always been this challenge, I guess. There's people using the platform that are extremely knowledgeable and are adding things like you sometimes, actually, who like to suck on the pink part. And then there's other people who are, more beginner and are relying on kind of getting their lips on some tasty fruit without having to really go out of their comfort zones right away and try out, plums and apricots and mulberries and things that, are pretty easy to identify. And so we've tried to really cast a wide net. What is edible to whom? And so does that mean that, all maple trees are technically all edible if you want to tap them for maple, for maple syrup? And some people do that and others would think that's absurd. On the map.
What, it takes a bucket and a spigot and, you have to go and check it.
It's a fire.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I listened to a few podcasts that are in the space of kind of considering how you build this new world that we might seek to create, where food is more readily abundant, where fruit trees are the norm as opposed to something that is just ornamental, because of the fact that, cities will invest in watering them initially. But after their roots are established, you don't really need to water them. And they can produce fruit and they can feed, well, yes, the squirrels and the birds, which I contend with in my own garden, but also just produce something that's viable, that's nutritious, and that can be harvested by anybody who happens to be passing by. So I think that would be a more healthy space. And one of them is, it could happen here. That's led by Robert Evans. And they had a discussion that was pretty deep about guerrilla gardening and what it is and how you can, choose a plot of land that nobody necessarily is working to maintain and do something as simple as toss some seeds or bury some pits, or even go as far as getting a sapling and planting it and doing something like wearing an orange vest, because if you wear an orange vest, everyone assumes that you're there to do work that you're supposed to be doing, right? And I'm like, well, this is really creative. And I started to imagine, the streets of Scotts Valley where we have some ornamentals planted along the side of the road. And one of the things they actually talked about is even replacing something that has recently been planted by the city. And I'm like, you'd probably get in trouble for doing something like that. But it just raises the question of, what choices would you even make in your own yard? Like if you have a yard that you have some soil in and you're choosing to plant a tree, why not choose a fruiting tree as opposed to a non-fruiting tree? When we moved into our house here, they had chosen non-fruiting cherry in the front yard. It's a beautiful tree, creates beautiful flowers every year. Every time I see it bloom, I wish it would actually fruit, right? But wishing doesn't make it happen. I might see 2 or 3 cherries that fall to the ground always before they're even palatable because it's not meant to fruit anyway, right? And ultimately, it just creates a beautiful mess when all the little petals fall to the ground, but no fruit in the end. And so I just think even making those small choices, I planted a Fuji apple in my backyard because it's self-fruitful and you don't need to have 2 of them. I then planted 2 pluots and only one of them for some reason will ever flower, even though the other is grown ginormous and I do fertilize it. Because only one of them ever actually flowered, I had to get a 3rd plum to be able to make it go ahead and produce fruit. So now I have a Santa Rosa plum, a pluot, and another pluot that's just a beautiful shade tree. So, who knows? Maybe there was some mix up and they actually didn't give me a plum. I don't know. But at the end of the day, I've got, the trees that I've chosen to plant in my yard are fruitful. My father gave me a pomegranate as my graduation present in June. I just received my MBA from Santa Clara University, and he came to my house with a pomegranate. And I chose to plant it on the front edge of my yard because I thought when it gets big, I'm probably not going to be able to consume all of its fruit in a time that will be manageable. So I'll plant it on the front edge of my property and I will put it on fallingfruit.org.
Yay, perfect.
and then people in my community can come and harvest the pomegranate.
I think it's a lovely idea. And I think it's a great strategy because, it's rather get help, right, with the harvest, especially in a space where you don't have to coordinate. There's so many fruit trees producing an overwhelming amount of fruit for their owners on private property. Mm-hmm. There's a whole class of organizations built around that issue, right? Falling fruit can help the individual forager kind of around the edges, in all of the public spaces and kind of on the boundaries with private land. But what about all the things, it takes a bit more coordination to, get permission and, then you're talking about a large volume, a lot more food unlocked that way. And so typically that's taken care of by all these different organizations that are doing urban gleaning. So coordinating volunteers with landowners, getting access to the resource, harvesting, sharing the harvest around the community. There's one that we helped start in Boulder because Falling Fruit didn't address this really. And there was a need called Community Fruit Rescue, which is still going, although I'm not involved anymore. And there, actually, another benefit of making sure that all of those private trees were harvested was not because of squirrels, but because of bears, which in mountain bordering communities is an interesting topic. There's a few other places like that in the United States. Well, there was a program in Squamish in Canada, in British Columbia. I'm not sure if they're still active. And then I believe in Missoula, Montana, where there was this direct connection made between sort of bear conservation and urban foraging, where you're not wanting to you don't want the bears to come into the city because that usually ends badly for the bears. And after garbage, once you've secured all the garbage cans and, you use bear-proof.
The bear bins and bear boxes. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Once you have that, then the next tier to take care of is actually the fruit trees. That was certainly been the case in Montana and Colorado. And so there's also that benefit to making sure that we're harvesting all of the fruit. There's another guerrilla strategy, which you didn't mention, but I feel it should be mentioned, is guerrilla grafting. So you wouldn't have to remove the whole tree. You would just, if it's a good rootstock, and well, for example, that cherry tree, the decorative cherry tree is, genetically more than capable, I'm sure, of hosting a fruiting cherry.
I'm going to do that this year. It's happening.
And so that's why, if anyone is wondering, on Falling Fruit, you can use it as a platform for also finding non-fruiting but graftable varieties.
You've just convinced me. So I could actually I could take branches from my existing Santa Rosa plum and the other pluot and graft it onto the non-fruiting one in the backyard.
Yeah, maybe. Is that one just never flowering either, though?
It flowers barely. It only produces 15 flowers or something ridiculous when it goes into bloom. I don't understand why. I haven't figured it out.
And I'm unfortunately my knowledge of agroforestry is not nearly where I wish it were. So that I would defer that to someone else to weigh in on.
Yeah, the other two produce an abundance they bloom like crazy. So it's just interesting. I wonder if it's the trees communicating under the ground with their roots or something. And I don't know. It's just an interesting.
They're oh, you have it covered, so I can take it easy.
Yeah, I don't know. It doesn't make any sense to me. For all intents and purposes, it absolutely looks like a pluot. It just won't fruit.
Mysterious.
Yeah, mysterious. So pluots, for those that are listening and may not know, pluots are basically a plum apricot hybrid. And so they produce a sweeter plum, but that it's a little fleshier than what you might be used to from a standard plum. And so they're delicious, and they tend to produce more fruit than an apricot tree will in my climate. So that's why I chose pluots as opposed to apricots.
Did you see anything in your neighborhood on the Falling Fruit map that you didn't recognize or that the name of?
No. I mean, I saw the technical term for the strawberry tree, which I didn't know. I just knew they were called strawberry bushes or strawberry tree, which I thought was really cool. There were really not that many. It was mostly lemon. A lot of people are listing lemon.
Lots of citrus in your.
Yeah, because people plant a Meyer lemon and they don't realize how much fruit they're going to get. And it's also kind of thorny and difficult to get inside the branches. And so some people just won't harvest half of the tree for that reason. And so one of the things that we do if we're going to host a big party and we decide we want to make lemon drops, friends will literally just ask around the neighborhood, hey, do you mind if I come harvest your lemon tree and get 50 lemons off of a single bush? So that's kind of incredible. One thing I have noticed during this pandemic time, the lemon trees in my neighborhood are fully getting harvested. And I think it's because people are spending more time at home. And they're also noticing them because these bushes are not actually listed on fallingfruit.org, at least not yet. I plan to maybe put them there, but.
Yeah, there's been a general uptick in interest in just one's immediate environment in general, but certainly also related to local food. I mean, one aspect is just while we're traveling less to far away places. So sort of trying to find fun adventures near home. Also just, it takes a lot of work to process to make these things oneself. And so if you're working from home, well, then it's, you can work around, you're much more flexible with timing for projects like this. So people started to bake sourdough bread, but also spend more time foraging and using the fruit from their trees. And we saw that also in the traffic on the website, actually. There was a very obvious uptick in interest.
Well, I think people are talking about it. The reality is that we have fruit trees in our midst that are just left to neglect. And if they're neglected and the fruit just falls to the ground, then it's really kind of sad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would encourage you to go and knock on doors, because I think it's really important to have to have conversations about these overlooked, forgotten fruit trees. You're basically bringing value to them. You're saying, hey, this is something of value that you have. I'm interested. Maybe they'll say no and then go away, but then think, oh, actually, maybe I should make use of this. It's clearly something valuable. Someone expressed interest.
Right. You might plant a seed for them. Yeah, that's right.
And, and at best, of course, they'll be happy to share, and it might lead to, other interactions. So I think, this is a great way to get to know one another.
Get to know people in my neighborhood even. I mean, the loop I take is about 3.5 or 4 miles, so it's not a small stretch, right? But I come across so many of those trees because when you're taking the time to walk, you notice things. Like we have plenty of blackberry bushes, which grow along both my property and also along the creeks here. The problem is they tend to be interspersed with poison oak, so you have to be careful where you're picking.
Uh-huh.
And then there's quite a few lemon trees, pear, apple, plum, cherry, pomegranate, and a couple volunteer plum trees that are just kind of growing too much in the shade, I think, to really produce enough fruit. I mean, that's what I noticed in my direct neighborhood. And when I looked on the map, all I saw was lemon trees and strawberry bushes that had been noted. And they were essentially on public land or on the edge of somebody's property. I have 2 Meyer lemons in my yard, but they don't produce that much fruit yet. They're still getting established. And so I tend to glean from the lemons of my neighbors. Mm-hmm. And then I will take surprise apples home. The problem with my walk is that I'm not, 8 feet tall. And some of these apple trees are quite large and they'll literally be 25 feet up in the air and nobody is doing anything to maintain them.
Do you have a fruit picking pole or thinking of getting one?
Yeah, I'm actually planning to get one and just make it a part of my tour because otherwise these beautiful apples are just falling to the ground. And it's such a pity to see them just literally become basically sauce on fall,
Yes, the stay and stay walks. That's, sometimes looking down is as effective as looking up when you're looking for new sources of fruit.
That's right. So what is your favorite fruit to harvest if you go on your falling fruit expeditions?
It's going to be hard for me to choose one, but I can describe what my new foraging routine has been in my new environment, I guess, here in Zurich, Switzerland. Maybe not necessarily in seasonal order here, but there's a lot of wild garlic, Bärlauch, bear garlic. So that would be Alis ursinum, I think. They're mostly eaten for the greens that grow above the ground, and they have this really nice, garlicky flavor. Make pesto with it. There's a lot of cornelian cherry dogwoods. So these are dogwoods that fruit, and they have these little red berries. And I've been experimenting with cornus mas, I think. There's a lot of Iranian recipes that use them. You can add salt and just eat them straight after they've been kind of in the salt for a while. It's really tangy and delicious. I made jam, but it's a lot of work to get the pits out. And you can put them in vinegar with mint. That's another Iranian method.
Well, you mentioned mint. Mint grows wild all over the place.
Oh, yes. Well, mint, of course. Nettles for tea, hops for beer. Right in my neighborhood, there's this really neat thing, a chocolate vine, Acolobia triloba. It's basically unknown except in Japan, where it's a fall delicacy. It's a really, really strange looking thing where the outside is basically a vegetable and the inside is a fruit. And it's very neat. There's, of course, lots and lots of apples in Switzerland and hazelnuts. And I harvested some walnuts when they were green. I'm trying to make my own nocino. So the liqueur. Mm-hmm. And then cherries. And I'm doing some rumtopf, which is like rum and sugar and a fruit that you age for kind of the holiday season. It's just so much fun. This is my thing to do when I want to you don't need to go too far into the mountains or something, just nearby, but have some sort of seasonally relevant little mini project.
Yeah, you reminded me, there are a couple of walnut trees in my local community here. And with walnuts, I don't know if people know this, I had a walnut growing up, but you literally wait till they fall to the ground. And so if they fall to the ground, the husk around them is black and it kind of peels away. And inside is the nut, just like the one you would buy from the store, unshelled. And so you can harvest those once they've fallen to the ground. harvesting them green the way you have additional preparation you need to do, right?
Yeah, the green, that's important for nicino because you actually cut it like the undeveloped fruit. You just cut and soak into the alcohol. But if you want the nut, it's actually easier just to let them sit, basically rot, like let the outside just sort of fall apart. And then you're left with just this dry nut, like, yeah, exactly like it's sold in the store, basically. I found a cache. This was someone else, saw another species foraging and then kind of picking from their cache. But there was some stuff stored in a barn, and had to go and get those things out of the barn. And like in the pockets of between the boxes, there were these big piles of walnuts.
Yeah, the squirrels were squirreling it away. Yeah. That's exactly what they do.
So I stole some of those from them. I hope they won't mind.
Well, they forget where they put stuff too. I mean, here they are just so busy with acorns that's what they go from all the oak trees, right?
So, which have traditionally been a major source of food for, human societies, but it's a work to process them.
You have to blanch it a lot until the bitterness is gone, and then it's edible. You can make cakes out of it and stuff. Well, more like tortillas, kind of. Yeah.
Well, there's a kind of a modern method. So traditionally be like maybe in a basket, in a stream, or some sort of moving water, but you can also put it in the flush tank of your toilet. Since that's cycling very frequently, have a little bag, a mesh bag with the acorns in there.
I think convincing people to use their toilet to make food is probably a little further than most are willing to go.
It's the top part.
Yeah, I know.
But yeah, it's maybe a little too close. I understand.
Yeah, that's a really great one, though, to think about, because the Salinan Indians, the Native Americans who were in this particular area, acorn was their primary staple in their diet. Not incredibly nutritious, but also just supply the calories that they would need to get through a hard season. And so made up a consistent part of their diet. I think it's so interesting that you have different vegetables and fruits available to you, of course, in Zurich that I hadn't heard of, like that wild garlic. Here we have, I think, plenty of like green leafy stuff. Like there's a lot of mint and things growing wild. So you can almost always find that. I plant basil in my garden, and strawberries is my ground cover because I like the things I plant to be edible. Just basically it. And I think if consumers or people just at their homes think about it this way, if you're going to take the time to garden, focus more on things that are edible, and, you can add spices that you grow in your garden to your soups in the winter. And you can add apples that you harvested from your neighborhood to kind of sweeten up some of those stews, or cook with your pork loin if you eat meat and things like that too. So there's so many things that you can do with fruit that you might harvest from your local neighborhood, and really just thinking about it a little differently is what we're inviting you to do today. I also wanted to chat about one thing that relates to climate and fruiting trees, and that is specifically the carbon sequestration of a tree rather than cutting it down. And so I wondered what your thoughts are specifically about using fruit trees as opposed to something that might be an evergreen or something along those lines, just from that perspective.
My gut feeling is that you can't really get a fruit tree to be nearly as large as some of the the big shade trees that are used in cities that are ornamental, but very effective at getting very large. Mm-hmm. Those would be more effective for sequestering more carbon, I would expect, in terms of, there's a more rapid growth. Fruit trees tend to be slower growing and then, not particularly long lived, maybe like an orchard tree. This is more like the mega edibles that I'm talking about that are really, partly because they're putting so much energy into producing these big, fat, juicy fruit means that, they just don't live particularly long and they don't get particularly enormous. So I guess for me, it's not something that I've pushed because it doesn't single out fruit trees or edible, food-bearing trees specifically. But certainly just more plants, more trees, tear up the concrete, plant stuff, make sure a lot of that stuff is edible because why not? And then there will be that win-win if we just have more green space. And I'm not I believe in a fairly cozy urban spaces. I think for all kinds of reasons relating to the climate, it's good to be, density is good and it can be very pleasant and very livable if done well. And a big part of that is, of course, having then a lot of greenery where there aren't people living or shops in the way, where there isn't buildings, a lot of that should be given over to green space. And because we need that, I think, to feel whole in some way. I live in this interesting model that basically does not exist in the United States, but is very common in Zurich. It's big nonprofit housing developments. So it's like a mega co-op, 1,200 people in mine. I'm in an apartment with my partner, but there's also some shared apartment. So there's all kinds of different living models built into it. It's 13 buildings. And then the whole block essentially is a shared space, and there's gardens, there's playgrounds, there's lots of fruit trees, sort of little herb gardens. So it's, I don't have to go far to find some rosemary, some thyme, some sage for the soup. And it's nice because, I get to have this open space. I get to have my gardening and foraging experience right here, but also there's a lot of people living, right around me, but get to share in this really nice communal space. So I really like the model.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like it's where a lot of cities are headed to, with living building challenges and things along those lines, where you integrate more green space and it becomes kind of a live, work, and play or recreation type of facility at the same time. So I think that's phenomenal. Awesome. Well, as we prepare to close, I have to ask you, is there a question that I haven't asked that you wish I had, or a thought that you'd like to leave our audience with?
I should always prepare one. And I always forget.
Yeah. Well,
I mean, there's certainly more that we could talk about, I'm sure. But something that's burning that we've missed. I feel like we covered all of the important parts. No, I guess you put me on the spot. Can't think of anything.
It's okay. Edit. So, these things, they get cut out if they stall.
If you let me think for longer, I may think of something clever.
Yeah, I'm happy to let you think. One of the things I have been thinking about is how I teach my children to think more about the open spaces and community and their day-to-day, because I think even involving them in some of this, either guerrilla gardening or harvesting from my local neighborhood, is something that will keep them more engaged with understanding where food comes from and how beautiful it is that, these bushes create fruit, or these trees create fruit that we could actually harvest. And I think I might get brave enough to go doing some of that door knocking with them in tow, because I think it would be a little harder for people to say no to a 7-year-old and a 4-year-old with a little basket all excited, right? So maybe I'll just make that an event, and also just think about whether there's a spot for me to create a community in a Facebook group or something like that within our local area to get people thinking more about this sort of thing, and reaching out to their community members when they have a plum tree that's full of fruit that would otherwise create a mess in their backyard if it wasn't harvested, and just asking people to come and do it for them,
Yeah, I think there's some action items here that people could take on. One is, of course, if they have a fruit tree on their own land, they're not harvesting from it, or they're harvesting just a small amount, whether that's adding it to falling fruit and saying, please, knock at the door and they'll let you in, or that's contacting one of their local urban gleaning organizations. And actually on falling fruit, there's not a comprehensive list, but already a pretty big list, especially for the United States, of those groups that I could point people to. And then otherwise, I'd really encourage people to start to engage in their city in this way. And, maybe that's finding that there really isn't very much and then complaining to the city government about it and expressing a desire for more. Or that's finding that there's actually a huge amount and adding some to falling fruit so others can also, help others get started. At this point, one of the things I really get a kick out of it is to finding new things. Mm-hmm. And partly that's driven by, or that's fed by my knowing that there's thousands of species. So that, I curate, I sort of keep an eye on the map, right? And there's thousands of species of food-bearing plants on the falling fruit map in all climates, or almost all climates. I think the one thing in Antarctica is like more like a Freebach, but not actually a plant. There's so many things I know to exist, but most of those plants I have yet to meet. And so it's also just a interesting tourism strategy, I guess. Show up in a new city, like, oh, okay, this is pretty different from where I'm from. Maybe there's some really, to me, very exotic plants that I can go and try out. So that's been a really fun. If you go to the south from Zurich, for example, hop on the train, you go through a long tunnel under the Alps and you pop out the other side in the Italian part of Switzerland. Italian-speaking part of Switzerland, and it's a Mediterranean climate, and everything's completely different. And one of the things that's really striking for foraging is that 1 in every 3 trees, practically, I think, is a chestnut tree. Mm-hmm. How it was in the eastern United States before the blight. And so you're just walking these trails in the wood, and it's just piles of chestnuts everywhere. And I think we think of foraging, it's always this idea of like things are hard to find and there's so little of it and we're all competing. And it's just nice to be in these, whether that's in the forest right out of town where it's just chestnuts everywhere, or if it's right around the corner from an apartment building, just being in having this feeling of abundance is really refreshing. Like, oh, this is accessible and there's lots for everyone. And it's, that's a good starting point for community building and just having a good time. So maybe I'll leave you with that.
So for somebody just getting started, if they want to be a forager, what would your number one tip be for them? What would you tell them? Like, hey, this is what I would advise you if you're just getting started.
The strategy that's worked for me is to really just slowly add in my repertoire very gradually. So starting with the things that I know, that maybe I don't know what the tree looks like, but I know the fruit. Going when it's like looking up when they're likely to be fruiting so that I really can identify them with a lot of certainty. Like, okay, this is an apple, came from this tree. That's an apple tree. Like connecting the dots, like going a step at a time, especially in cities that have the tree inventories. This is also super useful to use these because you have a very formal source of information that's very comprehensive. And so it's like a tree gallery, basically. Like, oh, okay, you're that. All right. That'll be useful come the fall, to have that, know that. So I think incrementally making those connections, going in the right time when there's something very distinctive that makes it much easier to identify, going with someone who knows more, of course, then using other resources, field books, the internet, but, just taking it slowly and adding on. And I think it quickly pays off. You can identify one species, when to go and harvest. Then you can add on more and you add to your repertoire, but you're already benefiting from the most basic knowledge is already serving you well.
Well, my tips are basic. Get a dog, take it for walks, and bring a bag. You already bring a bag to pick up your dog poop. So you bring a bag that's separate from that is basically reusable. And when you see a tree that's fruiting, take a couple home with you.
And realizing that if it looks like an apple, it probably is. Just because it's in the city doesn't mean that it can't possibly be an apple or can't possibly be a cherry, which is what a lot of the people that I met back in the day in Boulder, that was their block. It's like, could it be? But no, it's the city. It couldn't.
They think they're going to be poisoned. Well, worst case scenario, it'll be a crab apple and it'll be really bitter, right?
Yeah. Not all varieties are created equal in terms of their palatability.
Yeah, that's right. Well, thank you so much, Ethan, for taking this time with me today. This has been a really fun conversation. And I just want to encourage my audience to check out your website, which is fallingfruit.org. You can go ahead and visit the site. You can create a profile. You can add some fruiting trees in your neighborhood to the list. You could even just explore what types of food is growing in your neighborhood. So, Ethan, any closing words?
Go out, have fun, eat well.
And hey, most of that fruit, if it's growing on trees in your neighborhood, it's likely organic. It's likely non-GMO. If you're eating an organic, non-GMO lifestyle, hey, you're going to be doing more of the same. So I encourage you to check it out. If you aren't already gleaning trees in your neighborhood, it may be time to start. Now, as we wrap up, I want to invite everybody to visit my website, caremorebebetter.com. There we have an action page where you can discover different things that you might do in your community to just go ahead and make the world a little bit better day by day. This show always invites you to care more about a particular issue so we can all be better. Thank you, now and always, for being a part of this pod and this community, because it's my firm belief that together we can all do so much more. We can care more, we can be better, we can even regenerate Earth. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Care More, Be Better, a podcast for social good. To make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to podcasts. And share with your friends to help us reach more people and spread more social good.
This show is brought to you by Podetize, podcast hosting and done-for-you production services that get you heard by more of your ideal listeners. Visit podetize.com to book a free strategy call. That's PODETIZE.com.